Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me today. Like Professor Wolk just said, my name is Alissabella Adame, and today I will be discussing my senior thesis, which is reviewing the effectiveness of faith-based correctional programs in reducing recidivism. Now first, what is recidivism? Although some of you may know, recidivism is defined as the likelihood that an offender will reoffend once being released from prison. In the United States, it has been found that high recidivism rates often indicate systemic failure, a failure to successfully rehabilitate offenders. Approximately 68% of state prisoners are rearrested within a 3-year period, and then in a 9-year period, that 63% then rises to an 83%. 60% of the United States federal prisoners are reincarcerated within 2 years of their release. So in 2009, I believe, there was an analysis, and a 9-year analysis which essentially concluded that through that time frame, those inmates that had been released, they had committed about 5 crimes, getting them rearrested, which led to a total of 2 million crimes. As you can see, this is a very big issue. One, it shows that there is an ineffective rehabilitative and reentry program. 2, it's a massive economical cost on the community as well as the states. And 3, the broader societal cost really cannot be emphasized enough. There's actually research that concludes that a child of an inmate, they themselves will have a higher likelihood of also being incarcerated later on in their life. So essentially, it's not just this inmate whose life is being affected, it's their family and their community. And with this, what are faith-based programs? Essentially, they're a type of social program with a religious affiliation. In regards to what I did a systemic research analysis where I looked at 26 peer-reviewed studies that looked at different religions. I looked at Christianity, I looked at Buddhism, Islam, and etc. And my research question was, what does the scientific literature say about the impact of faith-based correctional programs on recidivism? Now, to get a really good understanding of this ongoing conversation that many social scientists have been a part of, one must really start from the beginning. So essentially, prisons were actually categorized and known as penitentiaries, emphasis on the word penitence. So essentially, these inmates were not necessarily only meant to be punished, but they were meant to be given the opportunity to go through a spiritual transformation period where they could repent for their criminal deviant behavior. So then this led to this idea of correction versus punishment. Now, the United States has gone through an incarceration boom. Since the mid-1970s, federal and state prisons population, in the United States has risen immensely. Mid-1970s, we had around 200,000 people being in prison. Now we have a population of over 2 million. And with this, like I mentioned previously, the very beginning had a very big emphasis on religion, right, and religion programming. Yet with the late 20th century, there began to be an emphasis on this other type of social science-based approaches that began to replace religion as the primary framework implemented in prison programming. This led to a rise in psychology, psychiatry, and sociology as the basis for programming. And essentially, what occurred is new penal science challenged this idea of this religious framework. But what has happened, and what have many social scientists have actually found, is that with this new method, there's not necessarily been a lot of change in regards to the reincarceration rates and recidivism. This has actually led us to what we're currently in, which is a religious comeback. So essentially, this quote-unquote failure of science, which is not necessarily that, and economical pressures, faith-based programs are a lot more financially feasible. They're financially feasible because 1, they're based on more mentoring approaches. 2, they can be done through private funding, not necessarily the state having to pay for it, has led to a lot of political support. And with this, like I mentioned, I did essentially a review and an analysis of 26 different studies. These are some databases that essentially were found. I used Google Scholar as well as Monday School of Library to find all of these sources. My search terms essentially were prison, rehabilitation, recidivism, religion, and anything that you can think of in that sphere. And the criteria that I looked into, essentially, I looked at all of these different variables, but the one that I really want to emphasize on is that I looked at similar research questions. I wanted researchers who were talking within themselves, not within themselves, I apologize, who were talking amongst each other that were looking at whether or not faith-based programs are effective in reducing recidivism. I wanted them to be essentially under that umbrella, not necessarily having the same research question and not necessarily going for one particular finding, but just really trying to emphasize and look into that relationship. And this is what led me to find these key analytical frameworks. Essentially, I found the structured equation modeling, which this is used to analyze the relationships among variables like religiosity and virtues, along with the survival analysis and Cox regression, which essentially was used to track the time that occurred when an individual was released into society, and then if they were to rearrest, what exactly was that time frame. Then I also used the propensity score matching, which that was used to minimize selection bias. So essentially here we had some researchers who did participants of faith-based programs and non-participants. Here's what we found. It's actually really worth mentioning that among the constant conversation of faith-based programs and what they could potentially do, many researchers have actually argued that at the end of the day, no matter what the outcome is, it shouldn't necessarily be respected to a higher scientific degree, because they argue that if an individual wants to participate in a faith-based program, whatever that outcome may be, it may have been coming from the fact that they wanted to participate, not necessarily because this faith-based program led to this outcome. And here we had then the Maryland Scientific Method Scale, which essentially, it's a 5-point scale. Here it was used to score the methodological rigor, and this was particularly used for those studies that did their own systemic analysis research, where essentially they looked at 13 to 15 studies, did something similar to me, and here they would essentially say, okay, they would classify the findings as working, unknown, or very promising. Now, some factors that were examined: one, we had the program length and intensity; two, sentence and incarceration length; then we had the identity and virtue transformation programming, along with behavior intentions. Now, with the faith-based programs, these are some elements that were found among a variety of my studies. I do want to preface, not every single faith-based program implemented every single one of these. Some of them did a mix and match, some of them only concluded one, but they were found so often that I decided to, one, share it with you guys and categorize them. So I broke it into 4 big categories: 1, religious support; 2, religious instruction; 3, spiritual practices; and 4, secular skills. Now, these are my findings. So these are the studies that found a statistically significant effect. And essentially, I want to focus on the South Korean church prison. Here, there was a 3-year analysis done, and participants had a 10% rearrest rate compared to non-participants that had a 23% rate for reincarceration. Again, just more because I wanted y'all to see all the things I worked on. Here we had our mixed results section. Essentially, this was a prison fellowship study conducted in New York. It was actually conducted in 1997, and then one that was so similar enough by the same reacher in 2004. So it was kind of paired up together. And essentially what was concluded by the researcher was that there was no difference between participants and non-participants. That was the overarching conclusion. Yet throughout his research, he very much did emphasize that participants of faith-based programs had a less likelihood of being reincarcerated compared to non-participants. Here, he did very much emphasize that it depended on the length and the intensity of the program, There was a lot of Bible studies. I believe there were 10 annually that had to be conducted. The individual had to participate in order to even be classified as a participant compared to a non-participant. And here's more next. And here are the studies that essentially conducted and concluded that there was no statistically significant effect found. We have the Pennsylvania Therapeutic Community, and essentially the researcher concluded recidivism does not decrease with the influence of faith-based programs between participants and non-participants, and the other studies essentially had similar findings. Now, with this, how was the effect of these programs being measured? It really did vary depending on the researcher, but here were the four main categories that were found. One, the time between release and rearrest, time between release and a new conviction, time between release and reincarceration, and as well as the response to hypothetical situations. Now, recidivism was reported in a variety of different ways, which needs to be emphasized because one, they had it as the definition that I introduced you with, the rearrest for a new crime. But others define recidivism as a technical violation, not necessarily an individual being reincarcerated for example, violating their parole, right? We also had self-reported offending, which essentially that could also be impacted by selection bias, along with behavioral outcomes. As some of you may have noticed, there's a lot of emphasis on behavior. Because of faith-based programs, many inmates have actually addressed that interpersonal aggression has decreased, so that's why behavior is a big factor that's often looked at as well. Now, the limitations that have been concluded amongst researchers is that recidivism as a measurement of something being effective is a limitation in itself, because there are so many other potential outcomes that can come from a program, right? Because recidivism has a dichotomous nature as an outcome. So essentially, if I, for example, talk about my brother, and I'm saying, you are rearrested, yes or no? Yes, okay, I'm gonna ignore everything else. Maybe this individual had successfully reintegrated themselves into society for 3 years, whereas because of that influence of faith-based programs, because at times there have been results that have showed that faith-based programs do lead to lowering recidivism, but sometimes there are diminished results in the time frame in which it's really captured. So after a 3-year mark, some recidivism rates actually begin to increase, but again, it depends on the length and the intensity of the study. Whereas if I'm saying yes or no, okay, I'm not really gonna look further into it and not necessarily seeing all the other different outcomes that could have been addressed and successfully help that individual reintegrate themselves into society. And two, how does one truly measure the impact of faith? The way that one researcher can define faith has varied. Some have religious attributes to it. Others have spirituality included into it. That measurement of faith in itself is very complex, that there's not necessarily a universal understanding and acceptance that could be applied to all methodological rigor being studied. And with that, some alternative measures that have been found is one, identity transformation. Participants of faith-based studies, specifically I believe the one in Dallas, spoke about how the individual began to view themselves, the participants began to view themselves as children of God. And having that perception meant that when they were about to act out or do something, they had that perception and not necessarily their own self-interest at heart. So that led to a lot of identity transformation in regards to doing one action over the other. Two, virtue development. There were many findings that concluded that faith-based program participants were able to have a more sense of gratitude. They had more compassion, they were more generous, more understanding, which essentially led them to successfully reintegrate themselves within the community and when released into society. And three, the psychological well-being of an inmate. Many of them actually address the fact that depression and anxiety rates decreased once they started participating in faith-based programs. Now, here are some studies that measured other outcomes, not necessarily just recidivism. As you can see, we have moral reform, well-being, trauma healing, culture shift, and responsibility taking. all things that have successfully helped an inmate and an offender. And so I want to focus on the ROD Ministries. This actually took place in Dallas, Texas, and essentially the participants found that the identity transformation that they had gone through, they emphasized that they were so, in the beginning, so aggressive towards one another, but the interpersonal aggression towards others and themselves decreased because of the faith-based program, because of the community that they became a part of, and that successfully allowed them to really just create a community not only in prison, but once they were able to reintegrate themselves into society, they were able to really get to the root of some things that triggered them, that led them to acting out and creating some criminal deviant behaviors. And with that, there are other influencing factors that very much affect recidivism as a whole. There's prisonization. This, have you been in prison for so long that this now is a new mentality that you've adapted? There's personal factors. Is this someone that essentially had a mental health illness that they didn't know about until they were incarcerated? To the societal barriers, is this someone that all they know is prison? Everyone in their family has been incarcerated. The community that they're coming from, they're more likely to be incarcerated than other people in different communities. Those are a lot of factors that can very much affect a recidivism rate. And thank you so much for your time. I know a lot of you are super busy, and it's a later time of day, but I cannot emphasize how thankful I am for my family, my mentors in my criminal justice community, Professor Lopez, who I have loved so much in our time together and just making me really want to be an aspiring lawyer. A lot comes from our time together. And also the attorneys that are here taking time out of their day, and just the community that I've made on the Hilltop. Thank you so much for everything. Words cannot describe.
So questions for Alissabella?
Yes, AJ. That's a great question. I'm a criminal justice major, and I've always been interested in reincarceration rates in general, because it's not just reincarceration, it's really the effects that it has on the community and the individual. But I'm also very big in my faith. I'm the spiritual development coordinator here. So getting the opportunity to kind of mix both of my worlds in such a way that I love and I really want to be addressed further, and to really showcase the positive outcomes of faith-based programs as a whole, was just really cool to do. So in a way, in a shorter method, it's essentially both of my worlds collided into one, and I was able to do this through the honors program, which is amazing in itself. But thank you. Great question. Yes. I don't know.
Okay.
Looking at how there's a disconnect between everyone on their methodology, do you think that moving forward there can be a consolidation of the methodology to get at this subject, to get better data and better ways to act?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's very complex, because here essentially, like I said, there's so many factors, and it's really like the way that I perceive, if I was a real scientist, and you were a real scientist, and the way that I perceive faith to my degree where I can back up, and if you bring another one and another perception, who is there to say like you're wrong or I'm wrong? And to really blend it in a way that could be ultimately accepted by all scientists, I think is just it would be a continuously ongoing conversation. I think we could very much meet in the middle in regards to maybe seeing like not necessarily a methodology that works for everything, but I think that there's just like so many conversations that can be had in regards to trying to address that. I don't know if that answers, but I think I tried. Thank you, Brianna.
Sorry. You have a question, and I'm going to give your crystal to.
My question is, what was the religions in the study that you kind of surveyed, like the span of religions?
Yes, so I looked at like Christian religions such as Catholicism, Christianity, Protestants, Buddhism, Islam, and I'm missing one more. And essentially, Christianity is the more dominant religion in faith-based programs, but there are other ones depending on where you are examining. So like the South Korea was one. There was one, I can't quite recall, but essentially those were the main religions that I looked into. Yes. Thank you.
Sorry, just one last question. Thinking about people who are incarcerated and like commit a crime, they become incarcerated. They might say they like lose faith in God, or they feel like they've done God wrong. How do you think that has affected like how they approach faith while they're incarcerated?
Yeah, that's a great question. Essentially, there was one study that actually addressed the fact that individuals who come in with a religious background are actually oftentimes less likely to participate to a certain degree, but those individuals who come with no religious background, they're more likely to have an effective outcome in regards to reducing recidivism with the implementation of a faith-based program. And so that's really interesting. I think that that can continue to be expanded upon, but that is something that was addressed that I found really interesting, because as someone who is, for example, a practicing Catholic, I would think that, there maybe those practicing Catholics would have a higher percentage, but at the end of the day, that's what the researchers has said, that there is a disparity between that. Yeah.
Really, such an interesting question, and that's such a great answer to almost end on. But Dr. Lopez, would you mind coming up? Dr. Lopez will get to say a few words about working with Alissabella on this project, and he'll also present her report and soul that she'll wear in a few short weeks at graduation before she's off to be the next Supreme Court Justice or whatever Alissabella has planned this month. But please go ahead.
Good. So I actually met Alissabella in one of the first classes I taught here at St. Edward's. And over the past 3 years, I've had her in several other classes. When I was in high school, I had a teacher who said, nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm. And Alissabella embodies that throughout everything she does, from the classroom to her involvement on campus. She's one of those people that is going to have an impact on the world, and to do that with energy, excitement, and faith. And I think that this was a good fit for her. I think she was very interested in the topic. Me throwing things on the floor, but no, she really dived into it and spent a lot of time going through all these different studies, page by page, and trying to better understand the impact of these programs. So I think she did a great job working on it, and I think she's going to do very well in law school. She may end up on the Supreme Court, or at least in some field where she's having a tremendous impact on the world around her, for sure. This year, the Criminal Justice Department bought challenge coins that say St. Edward's University and St. Edward's Criminal Justice on the back. We're giving these to all of our graduating seniors, and so I'm very pleased to give Alissabella hers.